Hello, Preston. Can you hear me?
Yes, sound is coming through loud and clear on your end. Actually, that's excellent audio quality. Now, I believe this is your first space. So, for those listening to the recording, I just want to congratulate you on taking that huge leap and being able to host not only just a space, but a space with an aspiring politician. So, well done on taking that leap, and I'm really excited to hear where the conversation goes tonight.
I appreciate that, Preston. Yeah, look, there are times when you need to take the leap, and I think this is an important discussion. So I'm certainly looking forward to seeing where it goes tonight. It looks like Jordan's just joining us here.
Yes, I've just invited him up as a speaker, so he will be able to hear us very, very shortly. In fact, right now he should be able to hear us.
G'day, Jordan. Good evening. How are you?
Yeah, good evening. I'm well, thank you. I appreciate your admirable efforts to try to get organised ahead of time and liaise with me. Today was not that day, sadly. But,
Completely understandable. Yeah.
yeah, Mondays at the law firm, it's always like the weekend has just had time to unleash the flying monkeys of hell upon whatever matters we're working on, and Mondays just seem to be a chaotic day.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But hopefully you had an enjoyable weekend with your wife's birthday, I understand.
Yeah, I did. It was awesome. She's absolutely the MVP of not just the Senate campaign, but my life generally. She very much keeps me balanced. She's a very sort of like easygoing, chilled out person, and I think if I was married to anyone who was too much like me, it would burn out, and I'd be a wreck. But she really keeps me balanced. So
It's a completely relatable sentiment that you've just expressed there. I have something similar, I'm glad to say, at home myself. So
I'm happy to jump on. I don't know if you want me as co-host as well, guys, or I'm more than happy to accept that invite.
absolutely, let's do that.
Yeah, and while Paul is inviting you up to co-host, because I know it's a little bit difficult on computer, I just wanted to once again. I know I say this all the time, Jordan, but I want to say once again, thank you for coming onto these spaces and doing spaces with us. And it goes to show there's a little bit of a difference tonight with Paul hosting his very first space, and it goes to show how you don't just do spaces with a select one or two people. It's not just you do spaces with me. You're happy to do spaces and talk to everyone and everyone on this platform, and that's the real libertarian difference. So thank you so much, Jordan.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. It's always great to meet new people and to hear different ideas. And Paul actually reached out to me after some earlier sort of free speech related advocacy that I was doing, and I hadn't come across Paul and his books and his sort of advocacy before. And when I did sort of start to read through them, I was really both impressed by the stuff Paul had been doing, but also struck by some of the similarities between our stories and our history, in terms of where we come from and sort of family legacy, I suppose, or the things that we have grown up being warned about and told about from our shared sort of cultural history. So it's very interesting, and it's always good to meet like-minded sort of fellow travelers.
Absolutely, and yeah, I hope to dive a little bit into that history with you, Jordan, there, because I think it forms an important part of this narrative, and we'll get into this a little bit later, I'm sure, as the space fills up. But one thing I think that's interesting in the libertarian space is because it's very much focused on self-sovereignty, we have different paths into this way of thinking, and so I'm curious about the types of motivations and backstories that people come into this way of thinking with, and perhaps that can be a useful discussion to help look to how we can generalize that pattern perhaps and apply it to more people and offer them a similar pathway to the ones that we've walked. So looking forward to getting into all of that. Well, while we're waiting for the space to fill up, I thought that might be a good opportunity for me to introduce myself a little bit. I'm sure plenty of people here already know Jordan, rightly so, but perhaps not so much familiar with my work and what I do. So my name's Paul Conlon, and obviously tonight we'll be talking about some pretty important questions here. We're going to have a great discussion. While we're waiting, though, I do encourage everyone to share this space on their feeds. As I said, these are matters that are relevant to everyone. But a little about me while the space is filling up. I'm an Aussie-born, Brisbane-based, actually, author, and I'm also a senior electronic and software engineer and a product manager. So I've worked my entire career in technical fields, and understand the power of digital technology is a double-edged sword, which is quite relevant to what's happening in the political landscape right now in this country. I'm also an ex-Australian Army officer, and importantly, a father who's interested in bequeathing the best possible future to the next generation that I can, which I think is a common tale, and again, quite a motivator. I'd love to hear more of your take on this, Jordan, as we get into it. But my journey into understanding self-autonomy and the libertarian mindset really kicked off over a decade ago, really, through an understanding of the financial system, which led me to understand gold and silver, and then Bitcoin, and then increasingly the general nature of the state. And I really got active a few years ago when I saw the makings of digital ID in this country go down the well-trodden path that my family experienced when surviving Nazi Germany's identification and censorship policies. They lived through the consequences of that. So given my technical background, I decided to write a book sounding the alarm on it. And that was a real chance for me to research and really connect with my family's history and apply it to a first principles moral and technical argument that makes a definitive case against digital ID. And I think those first-hand experiences from my own bloodline helped instill a deep suspicion, I suppose, of government, and really an urge to look beneath the surface on everything. We should be doing that in life. And anyway, if you're interested in all of that, there's more information about me and what I do and why I do it on my website in my bio. But tonight's not about me. It's about getting into what you'd like to do for the country, Jordan. So how are we looking, Preston, with the space? You think it's a good time
Yeah,
to
I will
start
just
kicking off?
go
Or?
through a little bit of housekeeping before we go ahead.
Great.
Due to the comments not working, which is a common bug, if you would like to leave a comment or ask a question in the comment section, you can do so by clicking the above post in the nest. And I'll be keeping a close eye on all the comments on that post. So I'll be reading out some of the best ones as the space goes along. So make sure you leave all your comments there. Let's go ahead and get started, Paul.
It's really interesting, Paul, just before we do, another commonality that I didn't realise we shared was I was very briefly in the Army as well at ADFA. So that was my first job out of high school. So it makes me smile to hear, there's many similarities, it seems, to our respective journeys.
Fantastic. Well, that's a good segue into, I guess, starting the evening. Now, Jordan, I suppose it's poetic to me in a way that you're a Victorian libertarian candidate in particular. Victoria, for whatever reason, seems to be the state of extremes where the struggle for freedom is concerned. I was just thinking the other day that Ned Kelly, for example, was born there in 1854 and operated largely there. And incidentally, the same year, and I think even the same month as the Eureka Stockade, which many would still remember was the armed rebellion against the brutal enforcement of colonial mining licenses at the time, and perhaps we can get into the topic of digital ID later tonight. But
well, I actually live in Ballarat, and my morning run takes me past the Eureka Stockade every morning.
That's so close to the history, yeah, and I think that history still has a lot of relevance today. In modern times, we've unarguably seen some of the most extreme cases in Victoria, in particular, in relation to the power of the state versus into the power of the individual. So I'd love to know, Jordan, what was that spark that drove you to be a part of this ongoing, let's call it small government narrative at the federal level? But is there something in the water there in Victoria, or are there parts of the state's history, and as we just discussed, parts of your own family history that's motivated you to get off the couch and fight for a Senate position for the Libertarian Party?
Yeah, well, look, I am a very proud Victorian, or I used to be. I used to really love, proudly saying I was from Victoria. And I used to say that, look, we've got really shit weather, but we've got great cafe culture, we've got great people, we've got a really thriving economy, and Victoria's going places. Now, unfortunately, all we have is cold weather and socialism. So it's a little bit harder to be a proud parochial Victorian these days. But yeah, it's interesting. My sort of journey off the couch, so to speak, as you put it, really started, I think. I'd been interested in politics for a while, and so my dad, he was born here in Australia, but he was born to two German parents. So my grandfather, George Dittloff, he was born in Königsberg in Ostpreußen, East Prussia, which is a part of Germany that, for those listening who don't know, was sort of the seat of the modern federal state of Germany. So the Kingdom of Prussia, first under Frederick Barbarossa, and sort of then onwards from there, sort of basically unified through a mix of diplomacy and war, the sort of disparate German federal states and city-states. And that's where my grandfather was from, and my grandmother was from a western state of Germany called Schleswig-Holstein, which is sort of like beautiful rolling farm country, a lot like Victoria, actually. And so they met before the war, were married prior to the war, and perhaps miraculously, in my grandfather's instance, both survived the war. And I say that because my grandfather was a communications engineer in the U-boats in the Kriegsmarine. So he was a young man who operated the Enigma machine, coded communication system on the U-boats that Germany operated in the Western Seas, in between Britain and mainland Europe, and now as an adult, knowing what their survival rates were like in that environment, it's a miracle that I'm here at all. But my Großvater first travelled to Australia by boat and sort of made a bit of a beachhead for himself and our family here, and then my grandmother followed him a couple of years later. And so my dad was born here in Australia, but very much grew up in a sort of continental European household, basically. And so his cultural upbringing here in Australia was very much German. German was spoken at home alongside English. And yeah, so that was sort of, so growing up for me, I was very lucky to sort of have that real, almost an immigrant upbringing, even though I was sort of second generation born here. And going to my grandparents' house in school holidays and over the summers and Easters and stuff like that, it was just a magical experience, and getting to share those sort of childhood holiday times with all of my cousins, and having that extended family and sense of belonging, and having cousins that I would think of almost as brothers and sisters, that we were that close and spent so much time together growing up. It's a really lucky thing that I feel very fortunate to have had. And it wasn't until I got older and sort of started meeting friends who might have been more fourth or fifth generation Australian and had different experiences of family that I really realised how lucky and how blessed and magical those kind of childhood experiences growing up were. My grandfather bought a property overlooking Bells Beach in Torquay and sort of cultivated to be, like home almost. There was like a beautiful sort of little pine forest on a fairly large block they had there. And, the pine forest had all the pine needles underfoot. When we go there, and it would feel, when you went there, it would almost feel like you were in this little pocket of Europe in the middle of Torquay. It was, yeah, magical. But I think growing up, as a result of that, I always had a very clear sense of the experiences my grandfather had as a young man growing up in the Weimar Republic in Germany. And in particular, he had personal lived experience of hyperinflation. He told me stories of going with his dad to the bakery to buy bread with a wheelbarrow full of money, and passing people in the winter on the road to the bakery who were burning that money to keep fuel, to keep warm in the horrible German winter as well. So growing up with hearing stories of like firsthand experience of the sort of economic horrors of the Weimar Republic, and then the governmental horrors that followed that, I think that just really gave me that crystal clear understanding of what harm government could wreak, either through economic recklessness and economic vandalism, or social and cultural vandalism under the guise of moral law. That those are the two sort of twin stories of Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. So, yeah, I grew up knowing that the state wasn't inherently moral, and I grew up knowing that the state wasn't inherently in any better a position to know what was right or wrong when it came to economics than, the sort of common man's wisdom, so to speak. And I also grew up with a very keen sense of being interested in world affairs and not politics at first, but certainly like geopolitics and what was going on in the world. Dad always insisted that we would read 2 or 3 newspapers. If we were going to read about what was happening, that week or that day, it wasn't enough to just read one account. You had to really read a couple and make up your own mind and find, where the truth might sit somewhere in between. So that was kind of always really drilled into us. And Dad, when we were kids, used to take out a big encyclopedia and sort of open it to pages and ask us, quiz us questions about different countries in the world and what their capitals were and all this sort of stuff. And it's sort of I suppose bred in myself and my 2 younger brothers, who are very different people to me and not really that interested in politics in adult life, but it really raised us to be conscious citizens of the world, I suppose. And so, yeah, I think I went through high school with that kind of awareness of what was going on in the world. That translated as a young man into politics when I was in the army and North Korea tested its first nuclear weapon. And I remember that happening and thinking, shit, this might be somewhere I end up. I'd better find out what's going on and keep abreast of politics. The politics could very, very well become interested in me, even if I'm not that interested in politics. But it wasn't until the WikiLeaks collateral murder video in the sort of first couple of years of the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, that really jolted me from that sort of Francis Fukuyama end of history, thinking that, Western democracy would sort of triumph and that the cycle of, great power politics and stuff would be at an end. And, it was like this real triumphant, the West has prevailed kind of time in the 90s when I was growing up, and then realizing that no, that's actually very, very presumptive and very, very wrong. And WikiLeaks and watching how they responded to the WikiLeaks videos like collateral murder and the cable leaks and all that sort of stuff, it just struck me in a way that I couldn't avoid that these governments were acting and responding the way they were, not because there was real threat or harm or danger, but because they were embarrassed and they were seeking to crush an entity and a person who was sort of exposing things that they didn't want people to see them doing. So that for me was just this real lightning rod awakening. And yeah, I sort of went from, probably something of a neocon to classical liberal, then to libertarian in the Liberal Party. And then, yeah, had a lot of friends in the Liberal Democrats at the time. So met John Humphreys, I can see in this space at that time, and others who were sort of leading the party then. And I was a young Liberal, and they were saying, well, what are you doing in the Liberal Party? Like, surely you belong over here with us. And I'd say, oh, no, it's a broad church, we can make change from within, and all this sort of stuff that I'm deeply embarrassed about. And it's sort of, yeah, that delusional sort of toxic relationship enabling mentality. And then, yeah, finally, through a series of events that happened in my life as well, I ended up, walking away from the Liberal Party. And when I was ready to return to politics, it was the Libertarians, as they became, was the only way.
Wow, thank you for that. There's just so much to unpack there, and I literally got goosebumps hearing you talk. It could have been me expressing these sentiments and history as well. You'd probably remember celebrating Christmas on Christmas Eve, given the European background,
absolutely. Christmas,
like I
Christmas
did.
Eve. Yeah, absolutely. And the beautiful, the Nutcracker Man and the smoking beautiful windmills where you would light candles and the windmills would turn, and just and Pfeffernuss and beautiful German, beautiful German food.
You're speaking to the power of culture there, and I think that's a thread that we're dangerously close to losing connection with. And like I said, there's so much to unpack there. The lightning rod awakening you spoke of earlier, I think it's happened to a number of people. And a couple of things that jumped out at me, what you said there was, what you mentioned, that it was a miracle that you hear it all. And I've had that exact experience. It's a very surreal, humbling feeling to think that, you know, for for a coin toss, I just might never have existed, for the very reasons that we appear to be seeing unfold at the moment. It's something like experiencing danger in the flesh without actually having seen it. And I also noticed that, you know, your grandfather helped build a presence here. There's a real sense of skin in the game, and I wonder if that skin in the game is something that contributes to, you know, wanting to push back against any efforts that erode that. And when you don't have skin in the game in a society, you know, what does it matter after all? But yeah, amazing you were taught to read and reason. I certainly remember my grandmother, who lived in Ratibor, that's now part of Poland, in Germany. They're teaching me the capital cities and the currencies around the world with pins on the map. So very nostalgic. So I guess that leads us down to a couple of paths. That sense of belonging. Do you think people today lack a sense of belonging? Do you think that's a cause of friction in our society? And do you also see parallels with the era we've just discussed with what's unfolding now, or does our history tend to, I guess, make us over biased towards seeing these connections, and maybe they're not as strong as we think?
No, I think the saying I like most about history is from Mark Twain, and he says history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I think that notion has a real element of truth to it, as I see it. I think that to the extent that we often fail to learn from history, we often seem doomed to repeat it. And the one constant through history is human nature. And that's true from probably the very first days we came out of trees, or however you think we began as a species. And certainly, like when you look at the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, they were immensely human, you know, and immensely relatable people. In many ways, they were far more advanced than we are in terms of the way they thought about the world and the way they understood their connection to the world. And I think that's something we've certainly lost. The idea that, you know, we talk about individual sovereignty, but that doesn't literally mean that we're all these atomized little empires of one. And the idea that we should be, or could be, is an immensely harmful falsehood that I think is largely perpetuated by the state. Because if you are the only sort of unit that matters, then the only way you can express the inherent human need to be connected and to act in society and to help others and to have relationships with others, if the only way you can do that is through the state, then that is the ultimate slavery. You know what I mean? Like the antithesis of the state and the competitors to the state is, you know, relationships, is neighborhoods, is communities, and you know, churches and voluntary groups and associations. And I think like that is our natural state. So yeah, I do think that like my grandfather came here and he loved Australia. Like he loved our sense of humor. He loved how cheeky and sort of casual in some ways we were. And most of all, he just loved the opportunity that existed here, that it didn't matter what your upbringing was or where you were born or, you know, how much money you had to begin with. You could come here and work incredibly hard and build something for yourself from the sweat of your brow. And, you know, when my grandfather came here, you couldn't just get a equivalency recognition of your education. Like he had to learn English. He had some English, but not sort of fluent English. He worked in the Ford factory on the production line for a time while he was learning English and getting his engineering degree recognized here. And then he and a guy called Nakula, who was a Greek guy, they started a construction company called Dymac Constructions in Geelong, and that built much of Geelong, so bridges, churches, some of the Shell refinery. And they were the first company to bring concrete pumps, cranes that would pump the concrete onto the slab directly from Europe. Prior to that, it was all wheelbarrows and hand mixers. And so they were some of the first sort of technological entrepreneurs to bring that technology out to Australia in construction. And as a result of that, he was able to retire at quite a young age for the time and spend the rest of his life sort of enjoying the world and his family. And but like, yeah, he was under no illusions about what the alternative was to that, about what Europe had become and could become again if people didn't remember the lessons of World War II. And I do think that is kind of where we're at, where, we have had several generations of people who really haven't had to experience, and in some instances in Australia have never had to experience, real adversity and real hardship. And I think that, it breeds a sort of a sense of both entitlement and complacency that I think is very dangerous. Because if nothing matters and if there's no appreciation of where the rock bottom can be and how, like, a well-meaning society and a well-meaning government can do horrific things, that it's not a function of evil people raised in evil ways intending to do bad things. It's often rather complacency and convenience, and that's that banality of evil. So I think it is. It's just that lack of context and that lack of connection to the hardships and lessons of the past.
Well, so much to unpack there too. The loss of connection is an ongoing theme, isn't it? And what jumped out, one of many things that jumped out about what you said there, was the timeless nature of our humanity. And in particular, I'm reminded of the Solzhenitsyn quote about the line of between good and evil running through every human heart. Without communities, as you said there, there is a risk, I think, of people, a timeless risk of people gravitating to the state like a parent. And I found evidence of this in my research of Nazi Germany for my book. And it was actually quite a dark chapter in my life. I was exposed for quite a period of time to the realities of what a state can become. And it actually got me quite depressed. And it's something that I took on, obviously, so I could produce something that could help reconnect, in your words, people to the past. And I happened upon quite an obscure Nazi era document. There's an amazing collection, hundreds of thousands of pages of scanned original typewritten documents in the online Bundesarchives that you can just freely go through. And I happened to find a memorandum to the Nazi government from, at the time, His Excellence Cardinal Pacelli. It was a notification or a correspondence from the church written to then Ambassador Dr. Diego von Bergen, discussing friction points between the church and the state. And just tucked away, it was written in January 1934, and just tucked away in this obscure document was this statement that really resonated with me. And it said, "A hostile, informal system lurks around every step, every word, and every official act. More than dubious elements try to make themselves important to the authorities as saviors of the allegedly threatened state." Now, that could have been written today, as far as I'm concerned. And I think without that connection to the past and without the communities that you described there, that's possibly the end game. So perhaps that's a good segue when we're talking about human nature to go in a slightly different direction. I'd be interested in your take on this. It's something that's been maybe in the zeitgeist of the Overton window for some time, but has dropped off, I've noticed, with the emergence of more pressing topics, and that is the topic of AI. Now, I like to overlay the topic of AI on the legislative landscape at the moment. We've all likely seen what happens when AI is trained on biased writing or content that's not appropriately balanced. There was the classic case of image generation that produced a set of dark-skinned African-American looking American founding fathers, for example. I don't know if you know Mo Gadat. He's the former chief business officer at Google X, and he's written a book on AI called Scary Smart. And he makes an important point that I think is very relevant to the policies being considered and adopted now. And he said, there's a fundamental shift in computing now, and that is that the code we write no longer determines what our computers do. The data we feed them does. Now, as an engineer, I'm concerned that the combined effect of the legislation being enacted today, and I'm talking about the type of legislation that digitally identifies us and uses that potentially to censor what we say online. Now, I'm concerned that will provide a heavily curated, I suppose, view of the world, and potentially give computers everything they need to discriminate and take exception to us far more than politicians can, and far quicker as well. And I'm also concerned that the training that these AI systems are being exposed to now, with the type of might makes right approach of government, is teaching a lesson that may very well come back to bite us. And this is totally new in our landscape. So I wonder, how do you see AI in relation to the crackdown on speech and the continued push to identify and label people? Is that a valid concern, or am I being overly pessimistic here?
No, I think your thoughts there, as you express them, are probably far more sophisticated than my thoughts on the topic. I find it really interesting, your journey into libertarianism and into concerns around digital ID and free speech is that of an engineer. You have that sort of way of thinking about the world that is very much about processes and structures, and I think that's a really refreshing and fascinating perspective to hear overlaid on, like, I am and always have been a fundamentally sort of a humanist kind of driven person. I'm someone who is fascinated by people. I'm very much a people watcher, and I sort of find myself thinking about the world in terms of relationships a lot. So thinking about it and kind of combining those overlays of relationships and processes, I think that's really fascinating. And I think the idea that, much as with children, right? Like, so I'm not a parent yet, but I've got parents and I've been a child and of parents, and I think as I've gotten older, I've learned to judge my parents a lot less harshly than I did when I was a kid. Because when you're a kid, you think your parents are infallible, and you think that they should know everything and that they should always meet the standards and the values they're teaching you, and that when they don't, they're hypocrites. And you really, like, children can be, I think, the harshest critics of their parents at times. And then as you get older, you realize, like, I'm now a good, I'm 7 years older than my dad was when he had me, and I think, my God, like if I had had children 7 years ago, what kind of a shit show would it have been? What would they have had to learn from? And in a similar way, if you're talking about AI, you can think of AI we're developing as children, learning from their parents, but learning incredibly quickly. And when the parents of AI are ultimately the state, then you have to be very concerned about the kind of values and the kind of rationales and conduct that the state countenances and sanctions. And I found, like, because I always find the most interesting observations about politics, about the nature of the state, come from people who are not interested in politics. That's been my experience for a long time. And as I get into legal practice and sort of enter into the legal sphere, one area of law that I'm fascinated by is international commercial arbitration. And it's all about investor-state arbitration between, investors in a particular country and the host state they're investing in, and between transnational corporations. And I was in WA late last year at the arbitration conference they have every year, and the head partner of Clifford Chance in WA is a very esteemed lawyer with huge amounts of experience. He was talking about investor-state arbitration, and in the middle of this big panel of lawyers, and there was this big conversation about all these other things, he was talking about, like, the advice they give their clients if their clients are suing states under investor-state treaties. And included in this advice they give their clients is that if they're suing a particular state, they basically tell their clients, do not travel anywhere where these particular states have influence or have a means of getting to you, because you will just have an accident or you're on holiday and no one will ever hear from you again. And that if you looked at the way states actually act when they can act with impunity and without eyes on them and without accountability, they behave like sociopaths. And this lawyer just quite candidly and matter-of-factly sort of sharing this, like, practical legal advice that they would give investors engaged in litigation against a state entity. And I just thought it was the most beautiful encapsulation of the nature of the state when you see it in action, and when it turns its sort of eye of Sauron onto you, and if we think about that kind of teacher or that kind of parent, teaching AI, then I think that is very, very significant cause for concern. So I don't think you're being overly pessimistic. And I think that if the state is parenting or teaching AI, then we shouldn't be surprised with the outcomes.
Yeah, that's, I mean, just about everything you've said to me so far is quite bone chilling, and it kind of confirms what I hope I'm reasoning from somewhat first principles. But yeah, look, everything you've said there, I resonate with. But I think parenting is a very useful lens to view a lot of the world through. And you spoke about that realization when you found out that you were, or the penny dropped that you were 7 years older than your father was when you had you, and how underprepared you still feel. But yeah, and again, that goes back, I feel, to connection and community, where you have a group of invested people who have skin in the game in the local community, and can help usher the next generation, uh, whether that be human or computer, into some sort of functioning, mature participant into the future. So completely resonate with what you've said there, and particularly the description of the nature of the state when we see it in action. And I think we see that uh, uh, continuously, almost continuously now, particularly with how Elon Musk is being treated, and with the kind of travel warnings as where vocal people should and shouldn't travel. I think this is the natural progression of things. And speaking of the nature of the state, I'd like to shift gears to perhaps another in-depth question. If you're up to it, I'd love your views on this particular line of thinking. It just occurred to me recently, actually over the weekend, I dusted off my copy of Sun Tzu's Art of War. It had been some time, and I just felt it was appropriate. And I happened upon a principle that struck me as perhaps relevant to how we approach voicing our dissatisfaction of the laws being proposed and passed today. And I'd love your comments on this. So the particular principle states, when invading hostile territory, the general principle is that penetrating deeply brings cohesion. Penetrating but a short way means dispersion. Now, it occurred to me that increasingly concerned citizens here are being forced to mount resistance campaigns, for want of a better term, in response to tabled legislation or announcements. And you could certainly be forgiven for feeling like we're just fighting brush fires with no end. And it staggers me, for example, that it was only last week that the age restriction on social media was announced, with its appropriate linking to digital ID. And then that went almost totally silent as the Mad Bill activity came into the fore. And I guess in my mind, what I was thinking over the weekend is, one way to phrase what Sun Tzu was suggesting there is that it's advantageous to make significant progress in one area of a campaign rather than superficial progress along an entire front, I suppose. And in fact, the reason I decided to write a whole book on digital ID is I saw it as a core issue that gives other bad legislation its teeth. The visibility and the enforcement that's possible with digital ID can enable all sorts of things that aren't even on the radar today, like conscription into future military conflicts, for example. So I'd love your thoughts on that distinction, on how Australians are best to deploy their resources. Do you think we should be jumping on each issue as it arises, or are we better maybe deeply targeting one or two core issues to pursue the more focused success that Sun Tzu spoke of?
Yeah, that's a really, I love that book. It's a fantastic book, and I think it's really a book about human nature. It's sort of, people think it's a book about warfare, but as Clausewitz said, warfare is a continuation of politics by the means, and politics is a continuation of human nature. So I think that Sun Tzu is fascinating, and my favorite Sun Tzu, which I think is very connected to the point you make, is Sun Tzu says, numerical weakness comes from having to prepare against possible attacks. Numerical strength from compelling our adversary to make preparations against us. So what he's also saying in that is that, when you are on the defensive and you're trying to focus on shoring up your position and reacting to things, then you are in a much worse position than when you are sort of actively engaging and being proactive and sort of seeking out the enemy, so to speak. And I think that the problem we have so often is that the first time we think about a problem is when it starts to affect us. And often by then, it's several orders of magnitude and several years too late. So I think that sometimes the answer is by looking forward into the future and seeing how things radiate outwards from a touch point. And for you, you've identified digital ID, and you can see the implications and the sort of butterfly wings rippling out from that digital ID. And I think that's very wise, and that has a significant amount of foresight to it. But I think that the idea that there's something lost by looking at things a bit more holistically. Like I am the sort of person, and this is probably why I'm not an engineer, to be honest, Paul. I'm the sort of person who, I'm a bit of a dilettante. Like I'm a real Renaissance man. I am not a specialist, and specialization, I think, rails against my nature and my desire and my curiosity to sort of dabble in all things. And as a result of that, I think I've realized that there's very few things in the world that you need to be an expert or a specialist in to do. And that, moreover, there are many synergies between things that specialists would just focus on in a narrow lane and never actually understand the connections between other disciplines or other areas or other fields of knowledge that specialization misses. And there's a place for specialization, and I've got great respect for people who have the mental self-discipline to focus on one thing at a time and to really deep dive. But for my part, I think I am much more inclined to look at the whole and to look at what's happening in terms of our fight against the state from first principles and from the nature of the state. Because what you can risk by deep diving down into a particular area is that, yes, you might, as Sun Tzu says, penetrate deeply and have real success in that particular issue. But from my experience, sometimes that simply causes another area to grow unchecked or unchallenged. And what I do know from experience is that the state very rarely sits idle, and it is a system that intends to defend itself and is very, very aggressive and has very strong survival instincts. And yeah, if you become too focused on one particular problem, then your victory in that area might be a Pyrrhic one. That's my gut feeling, but I think that the real answer probably is that a team of people or a movement of people with leaders who have the ability to do both, that you have a combination of skills and tendencies where some people in the movement, like yourself, are experts at or inclined towards drilling down into an issue and really unpacking it and exposing it and living and breathing it, while other generalists sort of stand a little bit back from the front line and observe the trends. That's probably the perfect world. So I hope that's not too philosophical an answer or avoiding your question, but I think that the answer is probably a mix of both.
It's not too philosophical at all. I love the depth that you're going into, and in fact, I got a lot out of that because I can certainly appreciate in what you said there about the power of combining the talents of a movement. You mentioned a team and a movement of people, and actually, as you were talking there, my mind was drawn back to the very successful Australia Card campaign, and I think one of the core elements to that campaign, why it was so successful, is it genuinely rallied the nation. It was unprecedented in that it cut through social divides, class divides, political leanings, and it was just a diverse group. It was spearheaded by politicians themselves, authors, journalists, leaders, farmers, doctors, barristers, sports stars, musicians, and academics. These are all areas of specialization, I guess, that people can come in and deploy their unique lens of the world in pursuit of a common goal. So I really resonate with that, and I can certainly understand the power of someone like you as a generalist to keep that view on, I guess, avoiding winning the battle and losing the war was kind of what you were alluding to there when you do dive deep. So that was fantastic. So you mentioned looking forward there. What does the fight against the state look like right now? It seems to me if a healthy society is a group of generalists and specialists who keep a finger on the pulse and look at what's coming, I suppose, before it gets orders of magnitude out of control, because we only pay attention to what affects us in our daily life. We seem to have a lot of, I guess, attention debt to pay back. And maybe that's why we're in the Fighting Brushfires scheme. So how do you see us paying back that debt? And what's the path to getting us back to that maybe steady state where we can kind of relax a little bit and keep a cautious, dubious eye on the political movements, but otherwise get on with our lives and enjoy time with our children? How do we navigate that in your view?
Well, I'm not certain that that's possible, and I'm also not certain that's desirable, because the problem we have is that our political enemies, and in particular, I'm thinking of not just the self-serving kind of general tendency of public servants to sort of defend their patch and to want to try to increase their funding and, you know, gain more influence, and just the sort of systemic, I suppose, stickiness that happens just naturally. Like there's the desire of a system to maintain itself and to defend itself and grow, and that's not always malicious or driven. But then there are people who are within that system and who are seeking to gain more influence within that system, like the Fabian socialists and the WEF Davos agenda type people. These sort of players in the game, if you will, they are sleepless. Like, you know, they are waiting for the lull in the battle and the defenders of freedom and the enemies of the state to sort of put down their weapons and go back to farming and to raise families and to just get on with their lives. Like that's what happened after World War II. You know what I mean? That the battlefronts were sort of abandoned and people went on with their lives. But the problem is that the enemy never sleeps. And so I think that unfortunately, that very natural, very human desire to be done with the fighting, or to get to a point where, you know, things are balanced and, you know, there's still things that aren't good in the world and there's still excesses in the state and whatever else. But, you know, like by and large, things are at a nice equilibrium and we can kind of, you know, abandon the barricades. That's a desire that I think ultimately we just will probably never have the luxury of having. And I know that's not a comforting answer, but my job as someone who's put up my hand to be a political leader in these times is not to provide comfort necessarily. It's probably to provide the reality, even when the reality is not pleasant. And I think that kind of reluctance to engage with the world as it is, and that reluctance to acknowledge that we are in a fight at all. I think that's, you know, if you talk about the Australia card and you look at what's happened since then, the difference between the response to the Australia card and the response to the COVID regimes and restrictions that were put in place is the story of a destruction of society. You know, you don't have a broad-based culture or nation anymore in Australia that is capable of uniting along a thematic narrative line. COVID saw our country, you know, cry out and beg for government-imposed civility and common sense for our fellow man. You know, like instead of looking at the Swedish model where the Swedish government said, look, you know, obviously this is an illness. We don't want our most weak and vulnerable to get sick. So everyone just do whatever you think is the most common sense thing to achieve that goal, and not have your grandparents die of a preventable illness. And people just behaved in a way that was civil and took polite precautions. And, you know, if they were sick and coughing, stayed home, or maybe they wore a mask or whatever because they didn't want to get other people sick, but they just didn't have this need, because they had a deep-seated cultural sort of shared understanding and agreed pact. You know, they still had a narrative. They didn't need this sort of imposed artificial, you know, government becoming the arbiter of life and death. And I think if you think about, like I said, that the difference between those fights, or the lack of fight in the second instance with COVID, it is the story of a society that has been attacked while the rest of us have been peacefully farming, you know. And I know that's like, I know that is, I'm very conscious when I say that for you and probably others listening, that's a deeply unsettling thing to consider and to hear. But I think all of you will hear it and know in your hearts that it's true. And so we have a lot of work to do. I'm a raging nerd, and I'm not going to apologize for that. And there'll be many Lord of the Rings memes and quotes and other various sundries throughout the course of the campaign. But in the words of Saruman the White, the hour is later than you know. And I think that we are at a stage now where there is a lot of work to be done. It's still a fight that there's hope within, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing and investing my time in politics and in the libertarian movement if I didn't believe that we could win. But there is a lot of work to do, and I'm kind of every day I wake up conscious of that reality and of the amount of work that is ahead of us. So yeah, I apologize if that's a slightly barren or sort of bleak answer, but it shouldn't be, because I think I am someone who is very optimistic about people and about human nature. And I think when I experience our culture out in the real world, like, X is great. There's often probably a lot more like-minded people here in these spaces than there is, at least at first glance, out in the real world. But like, you and I have spoken about it before, and a lot of people who have been part of these spaces and have sort of come to know me in my campaign and my candidacy or before know that I've got a story that involves, mistakes and criminal wrongdoing, and I've fallen short of my values and committed aggression and harm against others in the past, in terms of, theft and other sort of forms of wrongdoing. And when I came out of the other side of that experience, and I got out of prison and came back out into the world, I was very prepared and very ready to find a society that was as the mainstream media and as our politicians claim it to be, which is a mean, nasty place filled with discriminatory people who can't wait to throw you under the bus or, be biased and jaded and prejudiced. Like, that was what I was ready to find. Because if you just listen to if you listen to Neil Mitchell, and if you read the Herald Sun and whatever else, that would be what you thought our society was like, and that's what I was genuinely prepared for. But that's not what I found. Instead, what I found was people who were really genuinely willing to give someone an opportunity when they could see that they were being honest and having a go, and that they learned from their mistakes, or they were trying to learn from their mistakes and sort of have something good come of it. And like, I've just been absolutely humbled and amazed and really motivated by the caliber of the everyday Australian that I've encountered in my time since getting out of prison. So even before getting involved in politics, and now as a candidate, like, I think that the fundamental, like, goodness and earnestness of the average Australian, and the extent to which they very clearly perceive the problems and, some of the solutions as well, is a lot more than the average politician or the average mainstream journalist would give them credit for. So I think there's kind of like a sleeping giant in there, and Howard sort of was probably the last person to speak to that and to sort of really call on that sort of common wisdom of the sort of middle Australia, so to speak. And it might sound weird that an ideology like libertarianism, which, like, if you watch the news after the New South Wales local government elections, we're a fringe ideology, we're a fringe radical ideology, if you'll believe the characterization. But it's sort of funny, I think, that we have an opportunity to speak to common sense and the sort of basic decency of the average Australian in a way that I think the major parties don't. So again, I'm sorry to do like a Putin answer in a cast interview, but I feel like that's how I feel.
No need to apologize at all. It's far from a barren answer. I think it's a truthful answer, and my goodness, are people crying out for truthful answers at the moment. Just before I continue, I wonder, Preston, if we could start preparing to open the space for some Q&As, because we're coming up on an hour, so possibly some people might want to contribute and ask some questions, if that's okay. But before we do that, you mentioned your own story of redemption there, and you spoke to how incredible it was that people offered second chances. And first of all, I think your story is an amazing one, because your story of redemption, I think, mirrors the redemptive narrative we face now as a nation. Our nation has gone down a bad path, and our nation now has to deal with that. And it's so uplifting to hear you say that your take on the fundamental goodness of the average Australian is there, and that there is a sleeping giant, and we can face the challenges of this generation just like the previous generations did. And I think there's a lot of positivity in that. And I also felt like you were speaking, the human desire to be done with the fighting is absolutely real. And it reminded me, I think it was Jefferson who said the cost of liberty is eternal vigilance. So that doesn't go away. It's one of the fundamental costs of a meaningful life. And I think there are people out there who just, I guess, don't want to pay the cost of life, and whether that be the currency of effort, the currency of being involved politically and socially. And unfortunately, that all tends to lend to abdication to the state, abdication of thought to the so-called fact checkers and all that sort of stuff. That's no life to live. So yeah, I think the honesty there in your answer, although it's confronting, I think is actually more positive than the consequences of the alternative, which I think is the path that we're facing going down now. And that's why I've named this space Australia on the Brink. I think we're at an inflection point, and we need to decide collectively, which is not a term I often use, but decide together as a community, what do we want to pass on to our children. And again, going back to that parental lens, that's an excellent way to view this. A lot of things become clear through that lens. So how are we looking, Preston?
I just wanted to say,
sorry, mate. Yep.
No, that's right. I just wanted to say really quickly on that topic, just as a final note, a couple of years ago, I had a really, really good long form interview with Matt Wong from Discernible, and that's still available on Discernible's website if you want to go and have a look at it. That goes right into my story, and if you're not familiar with it, it sort of unpacks it in a lot more depth, and we sort of cover a whole bunch of things. We ended up going for about like 2.5 hours or 3 hours or something, I think. And I'd previously only seen him do about an hour long. And I said to him, I thought your sessions were shorter. He goes, look, I normally stop when I run out of interesting things to talk about and when people sort of run out of steam. But he goes, we could talk for probably all day. But one thing I said in that conversation with Matt was that I believed, and this was at a time, by the way, when I actually thought I was precluded from running for office. I didn't realize that I still could run federally under our constitution, under Section 44 too. So this time I thought that I couldn't sort of have a political future, but I said to him that I felt as though, and it's been borne out now by experience, that the first politician in Australia to tell people the hard truth and be honest about the sacrifices and the costs it's going to take to get us back on track will find themselves really propelled to great heights of success. Because I think that more than anything else, all Australians know deep down that what we are doing now is not sustainable on a whole range of levels. Like, we know that there is something wrong, and we know that we are living on credit, that we are living beyond our means and unsustainably. And I think that every major political party, be it the Greens, be it Labor, be it Liberal, they all have solutions that require magic pudding thinking. Like, I loved that story growing up when I was a kid. Like, you could just keep eating the pudding and it's any type of pudding you want and it never runs out. That's the kind of magical thinking we've got in our political class and in the lack of leadership at the moment. And that's because that's what they think people want. They think people want to be told easy things and fed platitudes. But deep down, and going back to that parenting analogy, where kids really don't want their parents to be friends with them, they want boundaries and they want leadership from their parents more than anything else. And I think it's the same in politics. So that's what I'd finish on with that.
Yeah, that's a perfect point. Not only do they want boundaries and leadership, they need it. And I'll certainly be looking at that, checking out that interview you mentioned there. And that's some really powerful points there. How are we looking, Preston? Would now be a good time possibly to open up for some questions and comments, or?
Absolutely. And if you would like to come up and talk to Jordan and ask him a question, please press the bottom left-hand microphone and I will get you up to speak. Now, we have a few Americans in the room and I want to say hello to them. And I really appreciate people from, I guess, all over the world coming and showing some interest in Australian politics. But we are talking on a specific topic tonight, which is we're talking to our Australian politician, Jordan Dittloff, about what's going on in our country at the moment. So I would ask that we stick to that topic, but let's start off by going to one of our American friends. Let's start off and go to Nice.
Hello, it's morning over here for me. I just want to thank you for bringing me up as an American. We're always interested in what's going on in Australia. So, Jordan, I'd just kind of like to ask you if you find that your constituents, do you find them to be complacent because they just don't care, or are they afraid to stand up?
I think Australia has that blessing and a curse of safety and security. You know, unlike America, we're completely surrounded by sea. We don't have a land border with any country. We've never been in a hot land war in our own territory, much less sort of a really seminal ideological battle that was the birth story of the American nation. Australia has, frankly, probably just had it too good and led a charmed existence. And so we're sort of like that person that never really had to work that hard. Australia is almost like the geopolitical nation equivalent of a trust fund baby. We're living off the hard work and investment of our forebears, and we've never really had to figure anything out for ourselves or find our place in the world. That's kind of the best way I could describe it. And I hope that's not, I'm not trying to sort of talk our country down. I think we've got so much potential, but I do think at our worst, we can sometimes be very complacent, and that Australian attitude of relax, she'll be right, sort of larrikinism that we sort of so often trade on, I think that can turn into a very kind of absent, abrogation of the need to take a position and the need to be involved in the world and stand up for what we kind of know deep down to be right, because it sort of feels as though there's no consequence one way or another, that we've sort of got this safety net, and that, we can sort of just muck around and then, run back in between mum and dad's legs when things get a bit scary. So I feel as though it's probably more the first thing than the second. I think Australians are not so much afraid of standing up and fighting. Rather, I don't think they necessarily understand the extent to which that's necessary to keep enjoying the things that they've always taken for granted.
May I have a follow-up question real quick?
Absolutely, go for it.
I'm just curious about the age groups that you find that are kind of like waking up and realizing that, they have a responsibility to the country, for electing representatives that represent their values. So who are the people that are most active? Is it, the 20 to 30-year-olds, 30 to 40? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think that the probably the most untapped potential cohort in Australian politics that really is, when I talked about before, that sleeping giant kind of metaphor, I think that there is a huge well of untapped potential for political change in people. Like, I'm 36, so I'm sort of at the kind of real tail end of this, or sort of beginning of this cohort. But people my age and younger, I think, are really seeing the world and realizing that they are objectively worse off than their parents and their grandparents for the first time in a long time. That, they can see that they aren't, they aren't getting what they were promised. They see the major party politics system for what it is, and they see that the emperor has no clothes. And a lot of them, prior to recent times, like in the last couple of years, gravitated towards, movements like the Greens and socialism, because that seemed to be the only voice that was admitting that there was a problem. And I disagree vehemently with a lot of the Greens and the socialists on the left on their solutions and their ideology, but they analyse the problem very accurately. And that's something I think we have to acknowledge. And I think that the youth of Australia are so ready and so hungry for a rational, principled critique of the status quo, that once we can tap into that and speak to them, and it's starting to happen already. I'm speaking to at least 2 or 3 people a week who are saying to me, I've voted Greens in the past because I thought that was the only principled protest vote I could make. I've read your policies. I agree with your values. I'm going to be telling my friends, and I think a lot of them will really like what libertarians have to say. So I think that at the moment it's kind of a bit of a sleeper demographic, but I think that will be the generation that, if we can speak to that generation before the far left or the far neo-Nazi right can, then we will have a cohort and a supporter base that will carry us all the way to government, I believe.
Thank you so much, Nice. You always have great questions. But next up, I want to go to Jeff. Jeff, please go ahead.
Good day to you guys. It's morning here. It's about 5 o'clock in the Americas. Good day to everybody. I hope that everybody's had a great weekend. And so then the bank, the central banks and the reserve banks, the top banks in
Jeff,
financiers.
I'm just going to stop you there, because we are talking specifically about Australia, and I know that you are passionate about what is going on over in America. But if you have a specific question for Jordan, maybe that relates to Australia, I'd love for you to ask that. If not, I'm sure there will be another space to talk as well. But you're welcome to go and ask Jordan a question.
Yes. Well, I guess that we're talking about the banks of every country, and in particular Australia. I find fond memories of helping my mates here in America load up all the Harley Davidson parts. They wanted to make 2 motorcycle dealerships in the 80s. One in, I want to say it was White City. Is that in New Zealand, I think? And then the second one was, I think it was Melbourne. And I helped these guys, be quiet. Don't let all these guys that ride bikes around here know that we're taking their parts to Australia. And I was like, okay, no problem. And
just because we are on a time frame, Jeff, I'll get you to if you can give your question in the next 30 seconds or so, just because we are on a very strict time frame. We are being able to have this opportunity to talk to an Australian politician. So I'll give you another 30 to 45 seconds just to ask a question, and then I'm going to move on to the next speaker.
Okay, so then, considering the BRICS is forming, and that 100 countries are going to go towards the BRICS for their money to be backed, and it's going to affect the West. The West is being crushed financially from that move. And then the books are being made in your country in October to November, and here in America, with the BRICS forming and the money being divided in this world into those components, and Bitcoin coming in to decentralize all of it. What is y'all's position on the BRICS and on the Bitcoin decentralizing the banks around the world through the investment of energy? I believe is the way that I've been explained to it. With that being said, what is y'all's position on that between the BRICS and the Western petrodollar, we'll call it? I believe that many European countries are considering BRICS. And what's your stance on that?
Thank you.
Please.
So maybe if I can formulate that to Jordan.
No, that's okay.
Position on especially Bitcoin. I'd be very interested to hear about as well.
Yeah, no, I think I followed your train of thought well there, Jeff, and I appreciate your perspective from the other side of the Pacific. I think that there's kind of two distinct issues there, although they both kind of fall within monetary policy. I think that as long as we do have an economy that's dominated by nation state fiat currency, I think competition between fiat currencies is far, far better than a sort of ascendant sole fiat currency. So I think that the demise of the US petrodollar, as you describe it, or at least the loss of monopoly of the US petrodollar as a world currency, I think that is fundamentally a good thing. It might be not viewed that way by some vested interests in America and other parts of the West, but I certainly view the rise of the BRICS nations and sort of competition between fiat currencies as a good thing. Because I think libertarians fundamentally believe that competition is always good, and that the best solution or the best non-violent solution to many corrupt systems is competition and innovation. So those are the engine rooms of change and of individual liberty. When it comes to Bitcoin, I think we are certainly on the cusp of a really exciting change in the way it's viewed. Here in Australia, we are very backwards compared to certainly states like Texas in the US, who have a terrific tie-in with Bitcoin mining and regular.
The stock market is going to be centered in Texas from New York City.
Yeah,
They're
look,
looking to pull that into Texas.
I certainly hope so, because Bitcoin has an amazing capacity and potential to help regulate regulate current stability and regulate off-peak and over-demand energy markets. That's a journey that I've only in the last couple of months been embarking on, and it's just been a fascinating world to learn more about. And I think that anything that provides a system of rules without rulers and allows individuals to both have real, genuine self-custody of their wealth and interact with each other in a rules-based way that doesn't rely on the coercive force of the state. I think that Bitcoin is a fundamentally very libertarian and very positive development for our future in Australia.
What is your opinion of Ron Paul? Ron Paul, in your opinion?
Just because
Ron Paul's the best president we never had. So
just because we only have about 15 minutes left, I am going to try to ask that we try to stick to one question per person. But thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate that, because I love hearing different perspectives on Bitcoin, because I think it's great that the Libertarian Party here in Australia are getting involved with that. So thank you, Jeff. Next, I want to go to Mark. Mark, please go ahead.
Hey, Preston. Once again, thank you, Jordan, for engaging with us in Spaces. This is more a comment than a question. Firstly, you were talking about your story before. I think it is a great example to people, especially in Victoria. We're going through a crime wave lately, and while some of those people, unfortunately, are so far gone that they can't really be rehabilitated, for a lot of them, they can still go down a different path. And I think you're a great example to them that, yes, a person can make mistakes, but still redeem themselves after sort of going through hell and back, and still make something of themselves. So I think that's something that hopefully will be inspiration to people. And secondly, as we get closer to the election, Labor are pretty averse at engaging in probably character smears. You've really taken that away from them by being an open book so far from election day. It compels them to debate the arguments and policies as opposed to purely sort of the character assassination part. So I think that's good, and it actually compels them to debate the issues going forward as opposed to going low and trying to ping someone's past against them, so to speak. And secondly, as far as next election goes, I'm going to post a fresh poll shortly, which should give a lot of people great optimism going forward. Let's just say it's very bad news for those on the left, and very promising anyone right of centre, put it that way. And if you're Anthony Albanese tonight, yeah, you will not be happy at all.
Thank you. Did you want to respond to that at all, Jordan?
Yeah, it's interesting. Just while we've been in this space, some of you might not have seen this yet, but the Australian just published an article off the back of the New South Wales Council election success of the libertarians in New South Wales, and it's actually got like a full photo of me next to John Ruddock, and it says, I'll read it to you. It says, the party's main ambition is securing a Senate seat in the next federal election. It intends to field anti-renewables advocate Jem Wilmot and self-described carnivore fitness influencer Lachlan Lade in Queensland, convicted fraudster Jordan Dittloff in Victoria, and an unconfirmed candidate in New South Wales. Redbridge pollster Cos Samaras said he wouldn't rule out the party snaring a Senate spot in Victoria or New South Wales. And Cos has no great love for us in the libertarian movement. So for him, for people like Cos and Anthony Green to be saying, you know, we're in with a good shot, that's an admission they don't want to make. Let's put it that way.
Nothing like publicity, my friend. You know, they're going after smears, but hey, I'll take it. I'll take it if I were you.
Yeah, look, I'll go the Jack Sparrow route and say,
exactly.
but you have heard of me.
I love that so much. But let's go to Mick for a question. Before I've got one as well after Mick. So please go ahead, Mick.
Thanks, Preston. Good to see you, Jordan, again. John, would you... It's probably a bit more of a comment with a question together, I guess, because just trying to mix it up from last night, obviously. Do you feel one of the biggest issues that society, as a Western society we face, or as an Australian society, better yet, right, is that there are too many people that aren't willing to take that next step to understand that that essentially they are responsible, like that maximum authority of being free, right? Because we are under an illusion of being free, right? People have this concept of where we live in a free society. You don't. You actually don't live in a free society, right? You have an illusion of freedom. But what is it going to take for people to understand that they need to take responsibility for the well-beings of themselves and their families to actually escape this system as such, as Uncle Clausewitz said, right? Because libertarianism is the anti-system by his own words, right? What's it going to take for people to break free of this system? Because really, like the title says, we are on the brink, especially what's occurring within Australian politics as such. We are at that turning point, essentially speaking. So what's it going to take?
Now, sorry to interrupt you, Mick, but I have just received a message from the host saying that the space may crash any moment now. So if that does happen, I just want to say, make sure you follow Jordan Dittloff. Make sure you follow Paul, because we will certainly be continuing this conversation another time. If the space happens to crash, I just want to check in with Paul. If you are there and you can hear me, Paul, please let me know. Otherwise, if I don't hear from him, make sure you are following the host and Jordan Dittloff, because we may have to continue this conversation another time.
I am here, Preston. Managed to reconnect, so thank you very much. Please continue.
Let me go back to Mick, and I believe you're finished answering your questions. Jordan, if you wanted to answer that, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way, perhaps. Like, not a different way, but my take on this, I think a lot of people are very concerned and spend a lot of time very worried and anxious about how to change society and set society back on the right path. And I think the answer to that, or the best answer, and the most the answer that's most within our reach now, right? Because libertarians have a tendency sometimes we want to design a castle in the sky and it's got street names and a cityscape, and it's like a Sims game. We want it to be 100% complete before we start. Sometimes that's our tendency. I actually think we need to borrow a leaf from the Fabian Socialist book, and we need to move 10 centimeters at a time every month until a few years later we're several meters towards the goal we want to reach. And I think that one of the most exciting answers to your question of how do we influence society and create a more libertarian society is in the idea of parallel societies, and the idea of investing in private solutions to currently public problems, to showing that things the government claims to be the only source of, or the only way that something could be provided, can be provided by motivated voluntary individuals. Creating our own little community farms, like what Matt Wong's doing. He's been doing his own community farm in southeast of Melbourne, and he's gone up to Queensland now to do another one. It's the fourth, I think, community farm he's helped set up. So just getting people running a farm, developing their own produce, building a community with skills that complement one another and reducing reliance on the state that way. I love that sort of guerrilla libertarianism idea of parallel societies. That's kind of my, I just, that really excites me. So that's my answer.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll leave it there because I go deeper otherwise, but we'll leave it there tonight.
Thank you. Now, Jordan, I have a question for you, and it kind of leads on from Mick's question. And I want to kind of lead this back to the title of the space, which is Australia on the brink. And we really are. We have things like extreme censorship coming into our country, and Mick kind of brought up what should we be doing. But I want to ask you, what are you doing, Jordan, about this? As someone, hopefully, we're all going to be voting for in this upcoming election. I want to know what are you doing to help save our country from bringing it back from the brink?
Yeah, I think that we are both closer to midnight and closer to dawn than we realize. I think at the same time, both things are true. I think that the beauty of the chaos and the cut and thrust is that you're only a few steps away from disaster, but you're also only a few steps away from possibility and from unimagined victory. So I love to sort of embrace that, and I think that the starting point, what I think that we can do now that is well within our reach is to return to federal representation with the Libertarian Party, to return to the Senate. I think that now, 10 years on from the last time we had Senate representation with David Leyonhjelm, Australia has changed a lot. I think the awareness of and the understanding of libertarianism as a solution to the problems Australia faces in terms of the global awareness of libertarianism. I think 2025 will be the year of the libertarian. That's going to be a big part of my campaign and one of my key campaign messages. I think we look at ACT across the ditch in New Zealand. We look at Javier Milei in Argentina. The biggest problem we used to have as libertarians was that people would say, well, where's it been tried before? Why should this work? Or how has this ever worked in the past? And we have two fantastic examples, one really close to home and one in Argentina, of libertarian policies just going buck wild and kicking goals and just doing exactly what we speculated they would do, and having the effect that we have always said they would have. So yeah, I'm super excited. I think that with a presence in the Senate and two fantastic and very different, fantastic in very different ways, state members in John Ruddick and David Limbrick, I think that the triune of federal Senate representation and two upper house representatives in our most populous states, I think that will start a series of dominoes falling that we are much closer to than we realize. Yes, we're close to the brink in a negative sense, but I think we're also very close to the libertarian movement and our ideas gaining a kind of a credibility and momentum that will become very, very difficult to put back in the bottle. And I can't wait to be ahead of that wave when it breaks.
Thank you very much. I want to pass the mic back to Paul. But if you have more questions, I would encourage you to leave them up to in the post that is in the pin post of this space up above you. Jordan is on many spaces, and we get so many opportunities to ask him questions. So please keep coming up to these spaces, keep asking Jordan questions, keep posting them in the comments, because this accessibility is just so amazing. How we have a politician who we can speak to about things that matter to us in Australia. But I want to pass it back to Paul. Paul, are you there?
I am here and as engaged as always. Thanks so much, Preston, and thanks for those excellent answers, Jordan. I really appreciate the questions too. There's obviously a lot of care and concern out there. And look, Jordan, one thing that I took away is you said 2025 will be the year of libertarianism. That sounded very refreshing to me. And you mentioned that the youth of Australia are so ready for a rational critique of the status quo. And it just seems to me that libertarianism is an excellent vehicle to provide that critique. So on that note, I'm very thankful for your time and your mental energy in particular, and I'm cognizant of the time we have with you. So it might be a good time to start wrapping up, and we've certainly covered an amazing range of themes, everything from AI to philosophy to German history even. And I'd just like to reiterate as we wrap up my big thanks to Preston for co-hosting here, and to yourself, Jordan. And I just think voices like yours in the Parliament have never been more important, and it's been genuinely enjoyable and intellectually stimulating to hear you speak, and I can't wait to hear that voice in Canberra, to be quite frank. So I might just hand it over to you, Jordan, for anything we may have missed, or some closing comments, and then perhaps we can wrap it up for the evening.
No, look, just thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed tonight. Was almost a nice sort of side quest from the usual very sometimes utilitarian political conversations. I really enjoyed being able to sort of explore a little bit of how we got here and what the future might look like as well, and a bit more of a philosophical tenor, which I really, really enjoyed. And hopefully it was something a bit different for some of the faces I recognise who have been coming along to quite a few spaces. And hopefully everyone who's listening to this space now or afterwards in recording got something out of it and kind of came away with a bit more of a better understanding of our ideas and my background as well. So I really enjoyed the space. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure, mate, and I'd be more than happy to do more of them if that fits your agenda in the future. So on that note, thank you very much for everyone for your attention and your time on a Monday night, and certainly appreciate it at a personal level, and hope to connect with you all again in the future. Thank you very much.